Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History. I'm just going to warn you right now, this is not going to be a fun presentation. It is going to cover a very serious topic in world history, one that has profound effects even to this day, as we'll see in a second. But we are going to continue with Unit 4, and today we're going to go on to Chapter 5, and we're going to talk about the creation of the Atlantic world. We're going to talk about the emergence of Atlantic trade. And of course, we've already talked about the building of colonies, but we're going to put it into terms of economic history, and then we're going to kind of transfer our knowledge of economic history towards understanding the transatlantic slave trade, which is a very big part in the building of that Atlantic system, that Atlantic trading system. So your Bellwork on the screen right now, what are some of the different focuses of European colonies in the New World? We've talked about Spanish colonies, we've talked about English colonies and French colonies and Portuguese colonies. What are kind of some of the economic focuses of these colonies? What are some raw materials they're trading with? What are some economic policies? Anything like that could work here. So yes, we are going to talk about, as the image might suggest, we are going to start talking about the creation of a new ocean-based trading system, the Atlantic system, the Atlantic world, as it's sometimes called. So yes, we are going to especially look at the nature of what is being traded, or I should say, who is being traded, and we're going to see that impact on the societies of North and South America. And lesson objectives today are going to be, for the most part, about slavery and economic systems. We're going to talk about the emergence of capitalism. We're going to talk about a new trade system. And we're also going to kind of look at slavery and how that impacts both society and the economies of the American colonies. And by American colonies, I am referring, of course, to North and South America. But first, let's kind of look at ocean trading systems first, before we kind of look at a general overview of the Atlantic trading system. But first, we kind of need a little bit of refresher, because we are seeing that one of the big changes in the period between 1450 and 1750 is that European states are becoming involved in ocean-based trade systems, especially as we saw in the earlier chapters, in the Indian Ocean. So we do kind of see that Europe is going to become involved in overseas trade, even within the Indian Ocean. But there are some challenges Europe is facing prior to 1750, really. For one thing, there's piracy going on. Pirates disrupt trade because they take stuff from trading vessels. But we also do see that prior to 1750, there are very strong Islamic land-based empires. These land-based empires, what we talked about in Unit 3, are not going to give up their land that easily to European society. So Europe is going to still be a minor presence, but they are nonetheless still involved in ocean-based systems, especially in the Indian and Mediterranean Sea trading systems. And just to kind of look at some changes in general, of course, that's a big part of this class, continuity and change. What are some changes after 1600? I think there's a question about this on your Bellwork. There's definitely questions on your test. So we do see that some changes are going to be that eventually Europe is going to gradually increase. We will see kind of more direct European presence in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea trading system. We are going to see the building of European merchant enclaves, both within Asia and Africa, I should say. And generally, kind of a big change that's going on is the decline of overland trade networks. In terms of continuities, however, we do still see the continued participation of Muslim states. We're going to look at that a little bit today in terms of West Africa. But we also see that, of course, in the Indian Ocean, as we discussed earlier. We're going to see new states emerge to capitalize on trade. And even though this is a change in the sense that there are new states, this is kind of a continuity in that states emerge to capitalize on trade systems. We've looked at that ever since Unit 2 and Unit 1, I should say. But another continuity, and one that's more relevant for us today, is going to be the continuation of different slave trading networks. We are going to see within West Africa slave trading continue, and the big change, of course, that we'll see is going to be European participation in that. But we also do see the continued trading of slaves in the Indian Ocean as well. So there are different continuities and changes in this time period. But perhaps one of the biggest changes is going to be the creation of a new ocean-based trade system, and that is going to be the Atlantic system, or Atlantic Ocean trade. And that's especially going to happen for the reasons you might have already guessed based on what we've talked about so far in this unit. The big cause of Atlantic sea trade, in addition to those technologies we talked about, in addition to colonization, is going to be the commercial revolution, what we talked about in Unit 3. Basically, remember, the commercial revolution is going to be this kind of change in Europe's economic focus away from agriculture towards overseas trade. That's a big result of that's basically what the commercial revolution is, to put it in a nutshell, actually. So we do start to see that kind of a new trade system is going to emerge, one that involves North and South America, but also Europe and Africa. And the way that we best express kind of this trading system is something, if you've taken an American history class before, you might already be familiar with, known as the triangular or triangle trade. So the triangle trade is kind of a model historians use to describe the trade system between Africa, the Americas, and Europe in the period, really between 1450 and 1750, just to kind of use those dates right there. In terms of what is being traded, well, we've already kind of looked at this in very very briefly when we discussed the Columbian Exchange. So we are going to actually see kind of a trading system emerge that's very much related to mercantilism that we've talked about before in in chapter 3, I believe. So how does the Atlantic trading system work? How does this triangle trade work? Well, essentially, the Americas, the colonies, are used for raw material extraction. So we see the creation of plantation economies, the creation of sugar and tobacco plantations, of cash crop productions, and we do see that kind of generally North America and South America will be used for resource extraction. We see silver and gold, but also lumber as well. This is going to be transported to Europe, and Europe is going to process that into manufactured goods. From Europe, we are going to see these manufactured goods be traded in Africa. And from Africa, we are going to see the selling of these manufactured goods in exchange for enslaved people. And these slaves will be utilized in these new world colonies. Raw materials like cash crops are going to be extracted through the use of slave labor. And the triangle trade system is a lot more complicated than what I've described. Obviously, there are manufactured goods going to North America, to the Americas in general. We see that raw materials from Africa are also going to Europe, but generally kind of the triangle trade is what I described earlier. But what is the impact of the Atlantic system? And we're going to look at its impact in regards to North America and the African states, but let's look at its general impact. Well, for one thing, the Atlantic system and this triangle trade, one of the big kind of results is going to be the further commercialization of the European economy. This is something that we describe as a cause of the commercial revolution, and we are going to see that that is going to lead to a rise of an economic system known as merchant capitalism. We'll kind of contrast merchant capitalism with industrial capitalism in Unit 5, but we are going to see kind of the development of a more capitalistic economy in European states. And merchant capitalism essentially, and this is kind of also describing capitalism in a way, it is going to be an economic system in which individuals invest capital or money into trading companies. And that's generally what merchant capitalism is. Capitalism as a general economic system is a system in which private individuals own the means of production. And what I mean by that is a private individual owns a kind of workplace, you could say. So a private individual, for example, owns a factory, to use kind of more modern day understandings, and they're the ones who buy the factory, they're the ones who buy the machines, they're the ones who hires workers. Basically, the factory is owned by a private individual. But in this case, this is describing an economic system where individuals own a part of a merchant company, where private individuals own a part of a merchant company. That's what merchant capitalism is. So we do see that another kind of facet of merchant capitalism is going to be, oh my God, the involvement of things like banks and stock exchanges and joint stock companies. These are kind of terms we associate with merchant capitalism. Another big impact of the fact this Atlantic system is emerging is going to be further demand for overseas colonies, especially for raw material extraction. That's going to lead to that competition I described in the last chapter. But one of the biggest impacts of all is going to be the transatlantic slave trade. And we're going to look at that in just a second. There's a video from Crash Course. I'd recommend watching like the first 5 minutes just to get a kind of understanding of what merchant capitalism is, because we're going to talk about industrial capitalism once we talk about the Industrial Revolution. We're not going to listen to you, John Green. So you should be able to describe triangular trade. You should be able to describe this new system of economic exchange emerging in the Atlantic Ocean. But the big focus of today, and something the AP really wants you to understand, and what is important for understanding not only American history, not only understanding European and also understanding European and African history as well, is going to be the transatlantic slave trade. And before we kind of look at the trade itself, we first have to establish kind of how is it being established? How are we seeing the emergence of one of the biggest transportations of human beings, very cruel and inhumane way in world history? And that is going to be what the transatlantic slave trade is, as we'll see. But one of the big causes actually is going to be the fact that Europe has created new world colonies in North and South America, and that these new world colonies are mostly producing things that require physical labor, intense physical labor, namely cash crops. Gold and silver, they will also use slaves there, but it's mostly in terms of cash crops. That's where the real money is, because that's easier to get for a quick profit. However, we saw already kind of different labor systems in the New World. We talked about Native American enslavement. We talked about the use of indentured servants in English colonies. But why do we see kind of a decline in those systems in favor of African labor? Well, let's look at kind of what the initial labor source is in the New World and see what are some problems with that, purely from an economic standpoint, unfortunately. So kind of one reason why Native American enslavement will decline, in addition to all these reforms that are passed by governments like the Spanish government, as we saw with the end of the encomienda system, is the fact that Native American enslavement is not really going to be as appealing as other forms of enslavement, mostly because indigenous people in North and South America, they live there. They know the land. They know the place that they are in. They can oftentimes, if they're able to escape, run away and blend into a nearby tribal group, into a nearby Native American settlement. Another thing is the fact that indigenous people tend not to be exposed to European diseases. They tend to be more susceptible to European disease, and thus are not going to be as populous, as you can see in this graph right here, this depiction of the decline of indigenous population in the Americas. But there's also kind of an interest by European states and by European colonials, by European colonists themselves, to convert indigenous people to Christianity, whether it be Protestantism in the case of English people, or Catholicism in the interest of Spain, France, and Portugal. But the reason why we do see kind of colonies and their economic systems will not use indentured servitude as much is for a few reasons. For one thing, indentured servants are white. And white people can kind of blend into other white people. If there are other white colonists on the island, on the settlement, in the colony, they can easily run away. They can kind of blend into a sailor, for example, going back to Europe. So we do see that indentured servitude is not really going to be as appealing. We also know that indentured servants have legal rights. They have a degree of rights. They have a contract that is overseen and supervised by the law. So there is going to be a fact that Europeans, white Europeans, have legal rights, and they can't be explicitly abused. Obviously, that's not to say indentured servitude was pretty, but at the end of the day, you still are a person with legal rights. And eventually, indentured servants don't have to work for you anymore because their contract could end. So if only there was a group of people who did not have legal rights, who were not considered legal citizens, who were not considered human beings even, if only there was a group of people who didn't know the territory, if there were only groups of people who couldn't easily blend in with either the white or indigenous population. That's going to be a major reason why European colonies will utilize slave labor from Africa. But before we look at kind of the emergence of this transatlantic slave trade system, we first have to understand what slavery was like prior to the transatlantic slave trade and how that's very different between the colonies in the New World and slavery in Africa and parts of the Middle East and parts of Asia. So we've seen already with different trade systems that slaves were exchanged, that enslaved people were exchanged, I should say, in places like the Trans-Saharan trade route, in East Africa, along the Swahili coast, in the Indian Ocean. However, even though that these systems of slave trade will continue, even as these land-based trade routes decline, slave trade still continues. But what is important to understand is the fact that despite the fact that these general kind of slave markets are emerging in the New World, and the fact that there are still slave markets in the Old World, these Old World slave markets tend to be less disruptive on African societies, as we're going to see later on. The transatlantic slave trade has a huge impact on the history of West Africa in particular. But another big difference is the fact that the status of slaves in Old World slave trading systems is a lot different than what we're going to see in the colonies. For one thing, something that is going to kind of be something different between New World and Old World slaves is the fact that kind of enslaved people in the Old World, in Africa and Asia in particular, oftentimes these slaves are going to be prisoners of war. That's how one becomes a slave, and that will continue as we'll see. And oftentimes slavery could be, used as a form of punishment. So slavery is not inheritable. That's basically what I'm trying to get at. Slavery is not something that you're going to pass down to your children. It's something one comes into as a result of circumstances like being a prisoner of war or getting into a sort of debt, a legal punishment for debt. And oftentimes kind of the use of slaves is also very different between the old and the new world. Slaves in traditional African states oftentimes are used as soldiers. We saw that to a degree in the Ottoman Empire. And while the Ottoman Empire has the Janissaries, they also do utilize slave military members, like the Mamluks, for example. So we do oftentimes see that slaves could be military soldiers, they could be domestic workers. That was more common, if anything. Sometimes they are used as concubines. It is very rare, however, to see slaves in widespread agricultural or mining production. That is a huge kind of difference that we'll see in the New World, is that slaves tend to be used as domestic workers in African and Muslim slave trade routes. And despite the fact that enslaved people are enslaved, obviously no one wants to be enslaved, we do see that kind of there is a degree of legal rights for enslaved people in these pre-1500 slave trade routes. There is a degree of legal rights. You can't be mistreated. You can't overtly mistreat your slave. A slave can sue based on mistreatment, based on abuse. We see that slaves could inherit property, not only between kind of their own families, but also with the people who have enslaved them. There can be kind of the slave owner can kind of give freedom as a form of inheritance. They can give property as a form of inheritance. And slavery is not inheritable, nor is slavery necessarily based on race. However, that's going to be a big difference from what we're going to see in the New World. And this term impressment, that basically kind of means someone who was a prisoner of war who is impressed or forced into slavery in our case. But how is Europe going to be involved in these already existing slave trade networks? That's something that this is something that is kind of controversial among kind of our popular understanding of history, is what exactly is the role of European and African states in conducting the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. Well, we are going to see European participation in the African slave trade for a few reasons. For one thing, European colonies demand slave labor as a form of labor exploitation to produce cash crops. Cash crops require an immense amount of physical effort. We'll talk about sugar more, but tobacco as well is extremely labor intensive. To think about the example of the American colonies by the English. Tobacco and sugar are very labor intensive processes, and nobody really wants to do it for a suitable there's not really suitable wages given for this, so we mostly do see an economic decision by sugar producers, by cash crop producers, to utilize unfree labor, to utilize slave labor. But we also see that kind of the slave trade will be able to happen because of the rise of merchant capitalism, because of the rise of joint stock companies. And these joint stock companies are going to be very influential in sponsoring the transatlantic slave trade. For example, there's the Royal Africa Company in the case of the British. It is a sponsored company by the British government, but it is partially owned by private individuals, by private stockholders. And something that is kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but something that is shocking in many ways to understand is that the slave trade couldn't have happened without a lot of these early capitalist institutions, without banks, without insurance companies, without these different joint stock corporations. And some of these banks and insurance places still exist today in England, for example. They have different names, but they're still around today. And that's why kind of understanding this idea of reparations, where people are coming from that. And that's just me connecting to more modern day history. But it is kind of something that is going alongside with this emergence of a new economic system. Well, what exactly is going to be kind of how this system works? How exactly do we see European trading companies get African slaves? Because it's not Europeans going in directly, using their armies to capture Africans and enslave them. Because we do see there is going to be a bit of cooperation between European states, European companies, I should say, and African states. So how are African states going to get slaves? Well, we are going to see a beneficial relationship emerge between African states and European companies. And that is going to be through African states obtaining slaves through warfare in exchange for manufactured goods from Europe. So we are going to see especially a cycle of trade emerge that some historians call the gun and slave cycle. I'll explain this term a lot more later. But we do see that kind of African states are going to go to war to get more slaves. African states don't enslave their own people. It's important to understand that there isn't really a solid ethnic group in West Africa. That should be obvious by now in our class. But it is a mixture of different societies, different ethnicities, different states that oftentimes are already competing with each other. So we do kind of see that this competition between African states will lead to warfare, and that warfare is going to result in the capturing of slaves, of human beings to be sold as slaves. And we are going to see that African states will emerge to capitalize on this slave trade, as we're going to see later on. We are going to see that there will be a lot of warfare in West Africa to accommodate this slave trade relation between African societies and European companies. We are going to see that slaves are obtained through warfare, oftentimes rival villages, rival tribal groups. They will go to war with each other to capture slaves. And those slaves are sold in exchange for guns. And guns, as we saw in Unit 3, mean political power. So we do see a lot of African states are going to centralize through the purchasing of guns obtained for the capturing of human beings. And then after kind of these exchanges occur between African states and European companies, we do see that these slaves are oftentimes transported over land to European coastal factories, to coastal trade ports. And it's from these slave fortresses, as they're sometimes called, that slaves are going to be put onto European ships destined for markets in the New World. And there are different spots where we see this kind of exchanges happen between African states and European companies, where the African states receive the guns in exchange for slaves. For example, one of the biggest area where slaves will be transported from Africa to the New World is in a region of West Africa, near the modern-day state of Angola, the Bight of Biafra. The Bight of Biafra is an area of West Africa. A bight is kind of a shallow region that's suitable for port trading. It's a region of West Africa where we do see a lot of European outposts. It's also a site where we do see these slaves put on ships, transported across the Atlantic Ocean, destined for the New World. And the Portuguese and other empires are going to be involved with this. The Portuguese set up colonies, set up trade posts in places like Elmina in Mozambique Island in East Africa, and Mombasa, also in East Africa, excuse me. But we also do see that kind of other factors will lead to a movement of people towards the coast. So it's not just this slave trade that will bring lots of people from the interior of Africa to the coast, but we also do see that kind of environmental changes. There's a drought in Angola, for example, and that leads to a lot of new people moving to the coastal areas. And the people in the coastal areas, they're going to go into conflict with these people from the interior. That leads to more slaves. So we do start to see kind of from this desire by European companies for enslaved people, that in order to meet that demand, African states oftentimes going to war with each other in order to centralize power and enrich both themselves and Europeans. And it's from West Africa, and it's mostly West Africa, but we are going to see the transportation of enslaved people across the Atlantic Ocean through what is called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is an infamous term. It describes this kind of Africa to the Americas leg of the triangle trade system. And we do see the transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. And this image right here is a very harsh one to understand the conditions on the Middle Passage. Because between 1502 and 1850, about 12 million people from Africa are going to be shipped from regions across West and East Africa to places like the United States, places like the Caribbean, places like Brazil and Mexico. And the conditions on these slave ships are extremely brutal. Oftentimes, enslavers, oftentimes slave trade captains would employ a tactic known as tight packing, in which, to maximize space, we would see literal human beings being laid on top of each other. One abolitionist, one person opposed to slavery in the future, he said that the conditions on board only limited an individual to a 4x2 foot square piece of space. It's extremely tight conditions, oftentimes segregated between men and women. Disease was rampant, would flourish amongst the people below deck. There was no sunlight. Oftentimes, there was instances of going on deck to dance for exercise, oftentimes to entertain, quote unquote, the European captains, European sailors. Sexual mistreatment and abuse was common, especially for women. And it is an extremely brutal passage, and it is one of the greatest crimes, I think, of human history in many ways, because in this period from 1502 to the mid 1800s, 2 million people died across the Atlantic Ocean. Oftentimes, to save money, these slave trading ships would notice that if their quote-unquote property was damaged, they could commit insurance fraud, basically. There's a case known as the Zong ship, the Zong trial, in which the captain of that ship basically committed insurance fraud by throwing out all of his African slaves. And I think one more kind of disturbing fact of just how brutal all of this is that scientists, marine biologists, I should say, noticed that there was a change in the patterns of sharks and their migrations. Because oftentimes an enslaved person who died was just thrown overboard. So it is an extremely brutal area of transportation in the Atlantic system, in this triangle trade. And there are videos I would show in class, but I'm not going to right now, that kind of describe the conditions in better words than I could about the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage in general. I'm going to skip the video for now. And we're going to look now briefly at the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, not just on Europe and the Americas, but Africa as well, because that is a big thing to understand for our understanding of African history, as we'll explore more in Unit 6 with the Age of Imperialism. But in general, we are going to see the development in the Americas and Europe of some new ideas because of this importation of Africans from, well, Africa to the New World. But we mostly do see that the transatlantic slave trade, despite being something that on paper is mutually beneficial for European and African states, is going to be generally that Europeans benefit more from the Atlantic slave trade. And we do see that this very profitable business, it's a business after all in the minds of these Europeans at the time, is that the wealth compiled by this slave trade system is going to be something that massively benefits European companies, the African Royal Company, not just the slave traders themselves, but all of the businesses associated with that. We see that kind of the wealth compiled by not only the trading of human beings, but also of the products that they produce, that's going to massively benefit European companies. This money is necessary in many ways for the Industrial Revolution. Without it, the money Europe had without the transatlantic slave trade, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened. And I think that's a very sobering fact in many ways. The wealth from this system of slavery was fundamental in the rise of the dominance of Europeans, and it came at the cost of human beings. And we call kind of this new system of seeing enslaved people as chattel or property chattel slavery. Slaves, as we'll see later on, do not have legal rights as they did in former slave trading systems in in Africa and Asia. But we also are going to see the emergence of those social categories that I described in our previous chapters. This idea that race is a distinction between different groups of people and that there are hierarchies based on physical characteristics, based on quote-unquote biological characteristics. So if we're thinking about kind of the origins of where does racism come from? Well, it comes from needing, in a way, to come up with a system to justify enslaving another human being. An image I have right here, actually, it's from the city of Bristol, which is in England. And obviously not many slaves going to England itself. There are some in the form of domestic workers, but that's fairly rare. But the wealth produced through the trading of human beings allowed for the rise of British imperialism. It allowed for the rise of European states to grow very wealthy. And this individual right here, I cannot remember his name, unfortunately. It's probably for the best because he was involved in the slave trading. Actually, his statue was torn down in 2020, actually, so fairly recently. But the impact of the transatlantic slave trade is not only going to be impacted in the minds of Europeans, but also in the Americas as well. As we explored more with the Columbian exchange, we saw the transportation of new groups of people into the new world of Europeans, but also, of course, Africans. And these people of African descent would be heavily used in the creation of these plantation systems that made these colonies the producer of raw materials for European benefit. And we'll explore this last point right here, but the introduction of a new group of people is going to lead to new cultural and ethnic identities. We'll explore that more in our next chapter, actually, in our next part of this chapter. But another big thing to understand about the transatlantic slave trade is its impact on Africa itself. And we're going to first explore this idea of the guns and slaves cycle, because essentially, as we looked at earlier, how these slaves were gotten was through warfare, was through wars that were intended to get slaves to sell for guns. And these guns were used in wars to get more slaves. And these slaves were sold to get guns which were used to get more slaves through wars. And these slaves were sold. You get the picture. That's basically what the gun and slave cycle is. It is going to allow for a continuous cycle of warfare within places like West Africa. And it's this division within West Africa that does lead to a weakening of African states that are not going to be able to compete with industrialized European societies. And we'll explore that more in our next, or in Unit 6, I should say. But it is opening the doors, you could say, for European imperialism in the 1800s. And we'll explore that obviously more in the future. But we do see that kind of new states will emerge as a result of this guns and slave cycle. These states emerge to protect themselves from being enslaved, but also to get slaves. And these include places like Dahomey of the Songhai Empire, of Ashanti in West Africa. These states will emerge as powerful regional kingdoms that are going to get their wealth through the selling of human beings and the purchasing of guns. Guns, after all, as we saw in Unit 3, mean centralized power. But there are examples of states in Africa that do resist this European encroachment, this European presence within Africa. and especially kind of seeing the destabilizing effect of European states in Africa. And one such example is going to be the leadership of this lady right here by the name of Queen Nzinga. Queen Nzinga, she is going to actively resist European, especially Portuguese, presence in her state in West Africa, right around here near Congo, or down here actually in Angola. So we do see that some states are going to organize effectively against European encroachment. Unfortunately, it is not the trend. It is an exception to the rule. But another big impact on Africa as a result of the transatlantic slave trade is going to be something known as the African diaspora. And the African diaspora is going to see this massive change, this massive migration, forced migration, of course, but massive movement of people from Africa to the New World, leading to those demographic changes I mentioned earlier. But these changes are impacting the demographics of Africa as well. We are going to see actually this has an impact on gender relations within Africa. Oftentimes, men are more valued as African enslaved people to work in physically demanding jobs. And we do see that kind of a lot of states and societies in West Africa are going to be removed of their male presence. And we do see kind of a change in what roles and responsibilities women have. Women have kind of higher roles and responsibilities. And yet we do also see the kind of that will lead in some ways to increased kind of ideas of property ownership when it comes to men and male and female relations. Kind of men have, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. What is important to understand is that there is kind of a decline in African men within Africa. And we do see a kind of shifting of new roles and responsibilities for African women. That's something that could be on your Unit 4 test. This is just a map to kind of visualize this mass movement of people. A majority are going to go to South America and the Caribbean from West Africa. Relatively small amount to North America. We'll talk about that a bit more in our next chapter. And finally, I would conclude, if this was class, with this video right here about the kind of untold legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. We'll, of course, explore the impact in the Americas more in our next presentation, but this video also covers the impact on Africa as well. We're going to skip it for now. So you should be able to identify these things. What are some impacts of the transatlantic slave trade on Europe, Africa, and the Americas? All right, well, that's where we're going to leave off for this particular part in Chapter 5. And in our next video, we're going to look at the conditions of enslaved people in the Americas. We're going to look at the status of slaves, but also we're going to look at ways people resisted enslavement, because that's also something important to understand, not just for your historical knowledge, but for the AP as well. Well, I hope you learned something. Have a good, pleasant rest of your day. And